All right. Welcome to week two, module two. We'll get started here, talking about we'll begin with the Protestant Reformation in Europe. Basically, this permanent fracture, you might say, within the Christian faith itself. From there, we'll move into the 30 Years' War, which is essentially the culmination of that fracture as far as the religious and kind of political strife that begins to erupt across all of Europe. After that, we'll move into examination of Russia, China, and Japan up to the about the mid 17th century, 1650s. And from there, then we'll turn attention overseas to the Western Hemisphere, talking about the politics of colonial settlement as well as the colonial experiences that the colonists themselves have in coming to the New World and the reasons for their migrations. So it's a pretty big chunk of information that we'll be covering. Again, this is going to be about 5 lectures or so. Um, we kind of got off light in week one. So without further ado, I probably will also include about a 45-minute documentary on Martin Luther and his life uh, that I'll post also. So when you see this, the Protestant Reformation slides will be with actually won't be independent. They'll be within a, um, a folder, the slides and that documentary. So to get that set up. Right. So again, the title here is the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, a fracturing of faith. What's important, perhaps, to understand right from the start is this is not only Protestant versus Catholic. That in many cases, once Martin Luther begins to successfully push back against church doctrine, Christian, or I should say, Catholic canon and tradition, that this is going to open the floodgates for a variety, a spectrum of interpretation with regard to Christianity itself. So it's not, Protestantism is um, painting with kind of a broad brush as far as what that entails. And it would include, the likes of things like Methodists and Lutherans and so on and so forth. So we'll be getting a sense of the full scope of that. That it's not just kind of a us versus them type of relationship. That this is truly a shattering of faith itself. You'll remember that the rifts between the church and secular leaders had been going on for quite some time, emerging as early as the 14th century. We could see this with examples of things like the Avignon papacy, where the French began to ally closely with the papacy, the, the, the office of the Pope himself, so much so that they are related actually by family, and that in the 14th century, the Avignon papacy, as it was known, was relocated from Rome, the Vatican City, to the southern French countryside of Avignon itself. When that happens, and when you begin to see this kind of close relationship between, in this case, the French state, the monarchy itself, and the papacy, this is going to call into question matters of papal legitimacy, papal independence with regard to other uh, nationalities or other people of Europe, whether they be English or part of the Holy Roman Empire or Spanish or you know um, what have you. So that in itself is going to create kind of a high degree of tension um, within the church. Also, as we talked about with regard to things like the Black Death and the onset of the Renaissance, the humanist ideas that begin to emerge are going to push back against the established kind of identity of the church. The church was primarily focused on having members of the laity, that is to say, the kind of church going masses of people, uh, practicing Christians, um, delay. gratification, to be pious in their behavior within their mortal life, to delay gratification so that they are focused solely on trying to perfect and attain salvation um, for their souls in the afterlife. The humanist qualities coming about as a result of the bubonic plague, but also the Renaissance, as explained in the previous module, in the previous weeks, uh, begin to really undermine that. And this is an erosion that is takes place rather rapidly. Uh, it's important also to understand that the church was suffering from a great deal of corruption, which we'll talk about in this lecture, which in many cases fueled the resentment and the disillusionment and disaffection that people like Martin Luther himself had. And this was the main cause for his defection. And of course, with Luther's success, with his not being necessarily punished and paying for his rebelling against the church with his very life, with this movement of his being able to be sustained largely through the protection of local secular authorities within the Holy Roman Empire itself. Martin Luther is German. Um, this means that this is going to, like I said at the outset, open the doors for a variety of theologians and religious scholars to begin to pursue their own interpretation of faith. So let's move ahead here. Again, we'll be looking at the overview here, as I said. Um, so Martin Luther is the first to really kind of be successful in retaliating and beginning to criticize the church and not pay with his life for that. But again, he was not by no means the last. So backing up a bit, going back here into the 14th century, just to give us some background and some perspective on exactly what the climate was at the time of the Reformation, which takes place in the early 16th century. It's important that to understand that uh, King Philip IV of France had been successful in helping to install Pope Clement V as Pope. And in return, in 1309, Pope Clement V was going to move, physically relocate the papacy from Rome, as I said, to Avignon. And this map of Europe, you can see again Rome here in what is today Italy, Avignon here located in the southern southeastern countryside of France itself, literally in the backyard of the French monarch. In 1378, crisis is going to uh, rock the papacy once again with the death of the sitting pope. This meant that a new pope was to be elected, and it meant that the leading cardinals, the Cardinal College of Cardinals, was going to convene in Rome in order to uh, start that process. They were met when they arrived in Rome. They were met by an angry mob of locals who wanted the papacy to be returned to Rome, and the cardinals complied, perhaps fearing out of the for their very lives. And so what happened was is that these cardinals, not interested themselves in living in Rome or returning to Rome, they decided to elect a pope that they thought that they could manipulate from Avignon, and that they could control easily, kind of a puppet-like pope. Well, this backfired. Um, when Pope Urban VI, who they chose and elected, um, when it turned out that he had agendas of his own, the cardinals reconvened and elected their own pope, kind of more of the pope that they wished to choose from the outset, who became Pope Clement VII, who was cousin to the King of France at the time, who was the King Charles V. Immediately, with that, again, family association, this meant that Pope Clement VII, the Avignon Pope, was going to gain immediate legitimacy, immediate recognition from the French nation, the French monarchy itself. But what you have here is two popes governing at the same time over the Christian world. And so this was what begins the Great Schism of 1378. Pope Urban VI ruling from Rome, and Pope Clement VII ruling from Avignon. And as you can see again by this map, this begins to split Christian loyalties from all across the Christian world. France, you can see Spain, Scotland, who was closely allied to France simply by mutual hatred for England, um, parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the southern part of the Italian peninsula, Sicily and Sardinia. All of these places begin to throw their support behind and recognize the right of the Avignon Pope. The areas in green threw their support behind the Roman Pope. Um, or the Pope in the Vatican City. So, obviously England, not necessarily a great friend of France at this time, was eager to support uh, a Roman Pope over a French Pope. Each side declared the other to be illegitimate, which you might expect. But what's interesting about this is that it was not only a political move, it was a spiritual one as well, meaning that in theory, no Christians were saved because each pope denied the sacraments of his opponents. So sacraments include things like mass, last rites, uh, marriages, all of these types of duties that the church carried out were now challenged and contested. And if burials were not properly administered, if last rites were in question, then this meant that the souls themselves were not being saved, or were not being identified as being saved by the entirety of the Christian community. As a result of all this, and realizing the lack of um, cohesiveness and the inability to really have this be the status quo moving forward, leading intellectuals within the church sought compromise, resulting in what's known as the Council of Pisa in 1409, where church representatives from each side, the Avignon papacy and the Roman papacy, um, began to try to meet to repair the rift. And they began by declaring that both popes were illegitimate, and as a result, the council called for them to be deposed. Additionally, and kind of moving forward, the Council of Pisa also went on to elect a new pope who became Alexander V. This would have ended the Great Schism had it not been for the fact that neither the sitting Avignon Pope nor the Pope in Rome recognized or decided to step down. And so Pope went from having, Europe went from having two popes to now having three popes. Um, and as a result, throughout the Christian world, this conveyed a sense of dysfunction, conveyed a sense of just utter futility in many respects. Fast forward to 1415, and the moderates in both factions began to reestablish themselves. Um, the schism had been going on for so long here, however, that the popes that had originally been elected had themselves died, and other popes had been chosen along this Avignon, um, Roman, and also with regard to the papal kind of authority bestowed by the Council of Pisa. In all three respects, all three aspects, the popes were now kind of second generation, you might say. So as a result, in 1415, with the moderates in each of these camps coming to a general consensus that this is just not in the best interests of the faith itself. Um, they managed to depose Alexander the Fifth's successor, and the Roman Pope, who was now Gregory the XII, stepped down voluntarily in that same year. The Avignon Pope was a little more cantankerous. Benedict the XIII was deposed in 1417, but didn't recognize that, and he still claimed to be Pope. But what's interesting here is that even within his own camp, he had lost all significant support. So really by 1415, 1417, the Christian world had returned to one pope rule. The damage really, however, had been done. This was a staggering blow to the integrity of the Christian faith and the church itself across much of Western Europe. So even before the kind of formal onset of things like the Renaissance and this spreading of a humanist ideal of individual importance, you might say, right? The church is already beginning to reel from the effects of its own self-inflicted wounds. Um, Once the Renaissance begins to really ramp up, this means that the church is going to have to turn from putting out the fires from its internal um, conflict and dissension to now having to grapple with the implications and philosophies emerging from the Renaissance itself. Humanism's popularity began to challenge traditional doctrine, and leading intellectuals within the church, looked to try and find some sort of patch to link humanist philosophy with more traditional Christian teachings. And they decided to try and approach this by placing a greater emphasis on social reforms that would help to facilitate and actually construct an ideal utopian like existence, a kingdom of heaven here in the material mortal realm. Two of the movement's more prominent members or figures included not only included Desiderius Erasmus and Thomas More. Desiderius Erasmus was a Dutch scholar. He was disciplined in his Christian, exhibiting his Christian piety as the ideal, the crux, the key to forming an ideal society. Again, a utopian-like vision. He believed that by maintaining and practicing Christian principles, that this would foster peace and morality. This meant, of course, living modestly, refusing temptations, things like greed and power that might be corruptive influences. And Erasmus was also, in his own extent, he was critical of church officials who abused their power and influence, which was pretty well expressed by this time. Erasmus, for his part, however, was more concerned with advancing mainstream consensus rather than breaking away from the church entirely. That Erasmus and also his friend and contemporary Thomas More believed that the church could be reformed from within, that it could itself be salvaged. And it's going to be others, specifically like uh, Martin Luther, that are going to disagree with that assumption. Thomas More, for his part, was an English lawyer. He was a friend of Erasmus. He supported the idea of creating utopian societies, just like his friend Erasmus. And he was especially inspired by the discovery of the New World, the Western Hemisphere. And he believed that, again, from a European context, he believed that providing for the social good through things like public facilities, think schools, hospitals, other kinds of public institutions would help to uh, promote a sense of utopian-like existence. Um, and he also believed that the greed that might be fomented by things like the acquisition of private property and the consolidation of wealth into individual hands might be curtailed as well. Because if people, in More's view, if people had equal access to these public facilities, then this would result in more of a kind of a public sphere, um, and also it would, in Moore's view, being the attorney, the lawyer that he was, he believed that this would result in the uh, having to pass or enact very few laws that would have to govern the society itself. He believed that laws themselves could interfere with peace and personal freedoms. But if everybody had equal access to everything that they needed, he argued that this would mean that you would have few laws because people, you wouldn't have to declare who had access to what, but also it would mean that there was very little chance of corruption or abuse because people again had access to all that they needed. Regardless of Erasmus or More's view, you get a sense here that it was rather optimistic, and it really kind of was one that was very favorable when it came to human behavior. Oftentimes in philosophy, whether it's in the realm of religion or in political philosophy, there are two predominant schools of thought. One being that human beings are inherently good and want to do the best, do the right thing as much as possible, as often as possible, or that human beings are inherently bad, that they are, corrupted or sinful in behavior, and they really can't help themselves. And that either the church or government, depending on the kind of focus, need to act as a an arbiter or arbitrator of and that type of behavior. So here, in the view of Erasmus and More, I think you get a sense of a very optimistic sense of human behavior. There would be other church officials that would not be so confident when it came to that type of interpretation. And one individual who felt that way was a man by the name of Martin Luther. And I believe I have about, let's see, I think I have just a few minutes left here. Let me check. Yeah, I've got about 7 minutes or so. So again, I'll pick up with where I leave off from here in part two. So by the 16th century, um, other members of the clergy were beginning to grow rather impatient with the church and its lack of self-restraint. Um, and so, uh, this one of the best examples of this came with regard to the policy of indulgences. To define those briefly, uh, indulgences are, in essence, church sanctioned pardons for sins committed by individuals. So it's a kind of get out of jail free card, where if you had committed a sin, the sinner could uh, be provided with this certificate saying that that sin that had been committed um, had been amended or corrected um, in one's own lifetime. And so this would, that would not weigh against their soul in the afterlife as God determined, whether this soul was going to be saved or damned. This idea of indulgences was in use in practice for quite some time within the Christian world, but its uh, application is what began to change over time. Now, originally, the sinner was to perform some act of penance, to either go on pilgrimage, to make some sort of sacrifice of time and energy, maybe even money in order to travel to a holy site and pray before it in order to win, an indulgence. Going on crusade, which had happened in the timeline prior to our own kind of scope of this course. Um, could be another effort or another expression of winning an indulgence, that you would not only sacrifice your time and efforts to make it to the Holy Land, but you would also fight on behalf of the Christian ethic, the Christian world, in freeing the Holy Lands in a Christian view from the infidels, from the Jews and Muslims that predominated there. In essence, indulgences were rewarded or rewards for people making some sort of physical effort to demonstrate their penance. Fast forward to the 15th and 16th centuries, and the church began, instead of having to insist upon some sort of physical expression of uh, you know uh, penance, that instead individuals were allowed to just simply donate money. In this way, basically pay for gaining an indulgence. People are like, hey, I don't really have the time to go on crusade or to make this pilgrimage. Could I make a donation? To the construction of church facilities, or to commission artwork, or to bring pay for the bringing a holy relic to a particular church, and the church began to engage in that type of activity. Um, so the purchasing of indulgences allowed a person to reduce again his or her time in purgatory after death. And what's interesting also is that this was extended to those who had already passed on, that you could buy indulgences for loved ones that whose souls might be being weighed in the balance, and have these indulgences applied to um, expunge their sinful behavior, for those that were already dead. Uh, why? Well, because it's lucrative. I mean, that the church is beginning to make a good deal of money off of this type of exchange, off of the purchasing of indulgences. It doesn't take too much to begin to see the inherent problems with this kind of receiving money for bestowing of these indulgences and the excusing of sinful behavior. First and foremost, the institution of the church, one of its sole functions, if not its number one function, is to oversee the salvation of its congregation, of its members. Well, now you have that same institution beginning to profit off of the sinful behavior of those very same members. So there is an ethical kind of concern here that begins to be raised. Also, the fact that you're attaching a price tag to absolution means that those that are wealthier can afford to sin. They can sin more often, and they can not be held accountable for it because they can just simply buy their way out of that, any type of punishment for that behavior. So it's for examples like these that really begin to, you know, upset rank and file members of the church, the laity itself. So I'm going to, yeah, I'm going to leave things there. I will pick up with kind of how this is going to feed into the greater whole here, and really begin to ruffle the feathers of the likes of Martin Luther and others in part two. So stay tuned.